At the height of COVID and the oppression of Australians for nearly 2 years with rolling lockdowns, some of the COVID supporters appeared brainwashed by the senseless nonsense initiated by government, and they were in boots and all. But with the damage already done, some of those very experts who sat quietly and afraid to speak up then are now coming out claiming that the mandated restrictions were actually all wrong. Joining us to discuss this is our political editor, Anka Sahin. Welcome, Anka.
Hi, Michael.
Now, it's been 3 years and there's been a lot of damage wreaked, lives have been destroyed, people have died, and yet we see some of these very experts who sat quietly when the world was thrown into what we can now safely say as deliberate chaos, and now saying that a lot of what the government did was wrong. Why do you think they're speaking out now?
Good question, Michael, and probably the best people to answer would be those people who were in positions of authority, in positions that allowed them to be consulted and their views taken in relation to these measures that governments were implementing back in the day, and chose, to follow the government line, or chose to say things that they thought the government expected them to say, so that they would not fall out of favor, so that they would continue to be consulted. And if they're saying something different now, I think the person who needs to answer the question of, why have you changed your views, would have to be them, because as you know, and as I know, as many of us know, there are plenty of other experts there with very strong CVs and track records and qualifications, who have been against those extreme measures taken by governments from a very, very early stage, and they haven't wavered in those views. They were not given as much airtime. Some of them faced cancellation and shadow banning and all sorts of campaigns against them, whether it be in the media or at their workplaces and so on. Yet they have continued to voice the same views bravely. So it's not a matter of, no, we couldn't say it, no, we couldn't do it. It's a question of, you've changed your view. What's the reason for that? And it's those people that must answer that question.
The thing we need to focus on is not so much the fact that they've changed their views, but the coercion and the oppression that led them not to express them freely and without fear in the beginning. Who was behind that? When we see APRA threatening cancellation and deregistration of doctors. So we're not talking about the anti-vaxxers and the conspiracy theorists. We ourselves have Professor Nikolai Petrovsky frequently on the show. He himself, he's a COVID vaccine manufacturer, one of the top vaccinologists and endocrinologists in the country, won multiple awards. He was cancelled. Every time we put him up, we were banned from YouTube. We were thrown off. He was banned from LinkedIn. He's now back on. How did we get to this point where bureaucrats are able to dictate to scientists and experts what they can and can't say?
It was extremely worrying, and the level of coercion that different people faced also was not equal. Depending on what position you occupied, who you worked for, whether you worked for the private sector or in public service, or if you were working for the private sector, whether or not your employer had regular dealings with government, for instance, which may have compelled them to follow a line that is more closer to what the government was saying during the pandemic. So all of those factors were relevant to the ability of people to speak up. But when we talk about these experts who have clearly changed their views, are we saying that they some of them perhaps changed those views and started saying that some of the measures that they supported, some or all of the measures that they supported were wrong in hindsight, and they can see that now. Are they saying those things today because they feel relatively free of that coercion that you talked about, Michael? Or is it that they have come to that conclusion freely back then and come to a different conclusion now through their own analysis of the facts and the information available to them? And I think that's really important, because coercion, cancellation, censorship should never be acceptable under any circumstances, even if we are facing a deadly pandemic. And of course, people will have their views on whether this was as deadly as governments made it out to be. We're not obviously discounting the fact that many hundreds of thousands and millions of people died, but compared to some of the pandemics in the past, when we didn't have the same level of technology and medical advances available to us, it's perhaps doesn't rank right at the top of all the pandemics that the world has seen. So I guess the question is, if there was censorship, and we know there was, because we know about that letter from APRA, we know that Australian doctors in particular were muzzled, and those doctors that did want to speak up, some of them were pushed out, some of them were forced into retirement. We know about that. Some of them were threatened with cancellation and had to backtrack in the face of that, because they had families to look after and lives to lead and things like that. And some of them bravely decided to go out on their own and set up on their own to escape a measure of that censorship. Again, it affected different people differently, but we do know that APRA set out to muzzle Australian doctors. We do know that. Now, when it comes to academics and people who are experts in epidemiology, immunology, virology, whose views were consulted, and who were whose opinions were sought as part of the government response. Now, if those people faced a level of censorship, as in if they were told or insinuated, or an implication was made that unless you say things along these lines, we're not going to take what you're saying into consideration. Well, if those things did happen, I think the public has a right to know, because not only was the public misled about the facts themselves, but they may have been misled as to the independence and goodwill of those experts themselves. And I think that's almost as worrying, if not more worrying.
And we saw a former head of the AMA, a former politician, while herself and her wife suffering severe vaccine impact, still supporting mandates, and only now has come out recently and admitted that her and her wife suffered severe vaccine and ongoing injury, and still was pushing and promoting the mandates for all, regardless of that. How much damage has this done to the medical profession and the government going forward? Should they say, now we need you to do this, will they be trusted?
Well, we know that a lot of government bodies have dropped their mandates a while back. Private sector employers who were previously very much in favor of mandates dropped them. I wrote an article about supermarkets and how, for instance, IGA never had a mandate, whereas Aldi and Woolworths and Coles did, and Aldi and Woolworths dropped them a while back, whereas Coles only dropped them as of yesterday, which is interesting, and only as a result of public pressure and this information coming out out there, people becoming aware that they were still imposing mandates on their staff. So as far as those experts who themselves may have either witnessed or experienced some of the negative impacts of vaccination on people who perhaps didn't even need those vaccines because of their risk profiles, because that's again information that's come out in the meantime, that the immunity that was promised by these vaccines in the market wane very, very quickly, as it could be as quick as 6 weeks, which is really nothing in the grand scheme of things when we consider the fact that the pandemic has been going on for 3 years. So those experts who have themselves either witnessed or experienced these negative effects and injuries, and who have still chosen to stay silent in the face of that, or continue to support the rollout without saying anything about the potential risks that were obviously there because they have seen it themselves with their own eyes, they carry a special kind of responsibility to the public to explain why they decided to go along and continue to support the process and continue to say nothing when they knew otherwise. I think that's really important, because going forward, if there is another pandemic or any other public health scare or public health threat in the future, the continuing cooperation of the public very much depends on that trust being re-established, and it has certainly been eroded quite significantly during the pandemic.
And it's going to be an interesting dichotomy here. Should the government be brave enough, or any governments or society in general, to be able to have an unbiased, unvarnished look back and say, yep, we were wrong, we made mistakes? There's recent reporting from the CDC saying there is a chance it did leak from a lab, that it wasn't occurring in nature. So slowly that, the line is becoming blurred between the black and white, it did, it didn't. Should the government be brave enough to say, we did make these mistakes, are they then going to be turned on by the fervent supporters of the government's line and then say, no, the government's wrong now? Or will those people also be brave enough and malleable enough in their thoughts to go, we were misled by them, we had it wrong as well? Do we have that capacity, both as individuals and as society, to accept we were wrong, should the proof be there?
Well, some people are already coming around to that view, even without a thorough investigation into the government response to COVID-19. I have said it before, and I will say it again. I do believe that a comprehensive inquiry into the government's COVID-19 response is most certainly required. But the caveat to that, and I have again mentioned this previously, the caveat to that would be that any Royal Commission or whatever type of inquiry is set up to look into it would have to have real teeth and would have to have its recommendations taken on board and implemented by the government of the day. That's really, really important. Otherwise, it just becomes a box ticking exercise where they end up saying, okay, well, some things were wrong, but some things were good. We've noted the lessons and we'll do better next time. And thank you very much. And let's move on. And that's certainly not what the Australian society needs, or any other society where such measures were implemented against the will of the people, supposedly for their good, but causing unintended consequences that other experts had warned about, but the government had chosen not to listen to. So I think that's really important. As to what will happen, will some people who supported the government line fervently back in those days turn back and say, well, the government is now saying something different, they may have misled us, and use that as an excuse to whitewash their own sort of fervent support of the government back in the day, using that the results of such an inquiry as as an excuse, or are they going to, as you said, perhaps turn against the government and say, no, you said X, Y, and Z back during the pandemic. We still continue to believe that, even though you've turned away from it, and actually double down on their positions. And there may be a smaller group of people who actually end up doing that. But I think we'll see more people doing the first version, which is using that. The results of such an inquiry as an excuse to say, oh, well, we too were misled, and actually, we had our doubts all along, and we weren't really sure, but because the government said this was for our own good, we had to follow it at the time, and now we know better, but what can we do, and sort of absolve themselves of any responsibility and even guilt.
All right, we'll have to leave it there, Anchor. It's fascinating times. It seems like, what was once a conspiracy is now a possibility. And if the needle keeps moving, it may well become a completely different paradigm that we're living in.
Indeed.
All right, Anchor, we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.